Rome, even now, is a very political city, and Italy is a very political society. I can recall a visit many years ago to Bologna, the birthplace of the great film director Pier Paolo Pasolini, a very political man. I was on the hunt for places associated with him, and I ended up, as one does, drinking with students of the university in some pizzeria slash bar slash coffee shop slash whatever else. But quickly, conversation about politics goes in all kinds of directions where you don't expect it to go, and everyone's getting involved. And in Rome, the propaganda posters for the communist movement and the right-wing Casa Pound, named in honour of the poet Ezra Pound, they compete for space on the same walls. You know, I was struck by social centres, some with red flags flying from them, others very much the opposite. In San Lorenzo, a mural of Bobby Sands, complete with tricolour and red flag behind him. Bobby Sands also someone idolised on the other side of the political spectrum there. And there's another mural of Bobby Sands now out in the suburbs of Tuffalo. And in a gift shop, the unnerving sight of a bottle of wine with the head of Benito Mussolini on it. That's not one for the bookshelf, really. So what I'm trying to get at here, probably badly, is that Italy is a very political society. You know, a young man in a cafe will extol the virtues of modern day fascism. The grannies sing Bella Ciao, and they mean it. Politics runs through everything. And when you're there, the story of Mussolini's rise to power is well told in museums, and central to that is the story of the March on Rome. But our story today is the so-called March on Dublin, a confusing event around which there is still little agreement amongst historians in August 1933. A planned commemoration on paper involving some 20,000 blue shirts on the streets of Dublin. That was the plan. It set alarm bells ringing in government and in other quarters, and people wondered, was Dublin about to see its equivalent of the March on Rome? Pádraig Óg Ó Ruairc has been on this podcast before, most recently discussing the fascisti in Dublin. And both of these episodes tie into his new book, just published by Head of Zeus, which is a history of the far right in Ireland through the ages, entitled Burn Them Out, topical title, a deep dive into primary sources, including state intelligence papers, which are really vital for understanding the blue shirts. And I feel one of the great strengths of the book is how it covers the 1920s and the 1930s, really getting into the ideology of what was going on at that time. A historian with a special focus on the War of Independence previously, Pádraig actually brings the expertise of that time, as we'll hear today, into this field of research as well. I mean, the name Eoin O'Duffy is familiar to people, but who's heard of the Brennans, distinguished War of Independence veterans who actually founded the Army Comrades Association, the movement that would become the Blue Shirts? So was this so-called March on Dublin ever more than Blue Shirt bluster? Was there anything serious at play here? And what about the Blue Shirts themselves? You know, what did they actually believe in? What were they all about? The book is available now in all good bookshops. I saw a stack of them sitting on the table in books upstairs. All gone now, and will be launched on the 15th of April in Hodges Figgis. Enjoy this edition of the podcast.
600 men and women members of the Young Ireland Association, or Blue Shirts, are on parade at Inchicore, County Dublin. The wearing of the blue shirts has always been banned, and so it is today. Civic guards hold up the procession and inform the parade that they must wear overcoats over their uniforms. The order is obeyed and the gathering proceeds on its way to the Bluebell Cemetery.
That archive clip is the Blue Shirts on the march in Inchicore and Bluebell nonetheless, in what was a considerably more muted affair than the proposed March on Dublin we're looking at today. And there's a lot about that piece of archive that's interesting. You know, the way the Gardaí kind of have the upper hand on the situation. But to understand the March on Dublin, it's vitally important to have a sense of the March on Rome, an event that grabbed the attention of the world and really did change the course of the 20th century. On the 30th of October 1922, the Italian king appointed Benito Mussolini as prime minister, putting power into the hands of the fascist movement and Mussolini's black shirts. It was widely reported on here at home, and as O'Rourke notes, it had an electric effect everywhere.
And this really kind of inspires ultra-conservative and right-wing movements across Europe to follow his example. It's funny that when we talk about the Irish Blueshirt movement, which comes to be led by Eoin O'Duffy, O'Duffy had actually met Mussolini. When he was Garda Commissioner, he led a pilgrimage to Rome and met Mussolini there. Other figures across Europe, like Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Mosley, of course, had travelled to Rome after starting that movement and met Mussolini. Mussolini was seen as being the global leader of fascism until he was eventually replaced by Hitler. And even groups we talked about previously, like the Black Rotha Linton Ormonds British Fascisti, who were based in Dublin, and we did a podcast on them previously, she had been inspired by reading newspaper articles about him. So it's from there that the idea spreads, and every country, fascism is different in every country because it's an extreme form of conservative ethno-nationalism. And because nationalism is different in every country, fascism is different.
The Blueshirts and the Army Comrades Association, those names are often used interchangeably. But before the blue shirt itself became a uniform, or before any nod to the language and the ideology of European fascism, the Army Comrades Association was created out of something else entirely. O'Rourke spoke to me about the Brennan brothers, War of Independence veterans from his own part of the world who had really distinguished and respected war records in the Tan War. And for them and other people around this movement initially, it wasn't a fascist movement. It was intended as something different in some ways from what it later became. At its inaugural meeting, it listed its goals as being to uphold the state, to honour the Irish volunteers who died during the Anglo-Irish struggle, and eventually to raise a national memorial to them. So it's a good question, isn't it, at the beginning? What is the Army Comrades Association?
When the Army Comrades Association is formed, initially it's made up of veterans of the Irish Civil War on the pro-treaty Free State side who also had to have fought during the War of Independence. So they didn't want what were called Trusaliers, Johnny-come-latelys, who had come in after the fighting against the British. Now, they exclude a certain number of groups from that, okay? So if you had been, in the they were also willing to accept War of Independence veterans who hadn't participated in the Civil War, but they were excluding certain groups. If you had fought in the War of Independence and you had taken the anti-treaty side, you were out. Okay. If you had been in the Citizen Army in Dublin, which was a left-wing socialist organisation, you weren't allowed to join either. If you had been, of course, what about the women? Cumann na mBan. There were 50,000 members of Cumann na mBan all around the country, and none of them were eligible to join. It was men only.
But quickly, the organisation broadens considerably. No longer was service in the Tan War or the Civil War a necessity, and the organisation increasingly came to see itself as one centred around the idea of free speech, at a time when confrontation on the streets, with the IRA especially, was relatively common.
And they say they're going to protect Cumann na Gael, which is the pro-treaty party meetings. And as it grows in popularity, they start expanding it. They go, okay, well, you can be in the Free States, have been a Free State Army veteran and be a Trusalier. You don't have to fight in the War of Independence. And then they open it up further and they say, okay, well, if you're just on the pro-treaty side in terms of politics, you can join. And their official raison d'etre, like their reason for being, is that they're saying, we are protecting freedom of speech and we are protecting the rights of Cumann na Gael parties to meet and to have candidates and election rallies. And they say we're being attacked by the IRA. And certainly there was violence at some of these meetings. But they say we're being attacked by the IRA, but they also say the IRA is a secret communist organization. And they start very quickly talking about how, this is part of a wider global conspiracy and all this stuff. And if you read some accounts, they will say that, well, we started wearing blue shirts as an unofficial uniform just so we could recognize each other when fighting broke out at rival factions at these rallies. But very quickly, Ned Cronin is the guy who decides that that we're going to formally wear a blue shirt. And you have shirted movements, you have Hitler's brown shirts, you have Mussolini's black shirts. We're talking about the 1930s at this stage. Adopting a shirted movement, a shirted street movement is one of the key things in fascism. And also they start adopting the straight-armed Nazi fascist Roman salute.
A nightmare vision became a reality for this movement in 1932 with the election of a Fianna Fáil government. And on the very eve of that election, a publication produced by the outgoing government party, Cumann na Gael, warned that if Fianna Fáil came to power, the extremist minority, as in Spain, as in Mexico, as in Russia, will get the upper hand. It is your duty to help the government to eliminate once and for all the danger of a Spanish Republic in Ireland. A careless electorate gave Spain a weak government, then the rest came. Now, fear, genuine or otherwise, of what a Fianna Fáil government would mean had far-reaching effects on politics. And a Garda commissioner, Eoin O'Duffy, begins plotting.
Eoin O'Duffy was Garda commissioner at the time, but of course, when De Valera comes to power, Eoin O'Duffy and the Gardaí are talking about having a mutiny against him. And they actually go in and they meet some of the Irish Army officers and say that we're planning a mutiny. We won't let De Valera take power. And one of the people who actually shoots it down is Michael Brennan. The brother is leader of the Army Comrades Association. He goes, absolutely no way. I don't like De Valera any more than you do, but we're not doing this. And I have organised the army. And if the Guards and Eoin O'Duffy and, lead a resistance, we will put it down. So Ireland's one of the few countries in Europe that has this, successful transfer of democracy.
De Valera, unsurprisingly, moves against O'Duffy early in 1933. He's sacked as Garda Commissioner. And this paves the way for him to take over the Army Comrades Association. This would significantly change the shape of the organisation, which became considerably more ideologically rooted in what was happening elsewhere.
He fires O'Duffy because, of course, this guy has threatened to lead a mutiny against him, and O'Duffy is offered a nice civil service job and he doesn't take it. And where does he go except off to Rome again to meet this Mussolini chap and to see what fascism is like in Italy. And Cumann na Gael are calling for him to be reinstated as Garda Commissioner. Now, they don't mention the fact that they, as a government, had actually discussed sacking him as Garda Commissioner because they thought he was incompetent. They thought, or they knew he was an alcoholic. They thought there was indiscipline amongst the ranks and corruption. But as soon as he became this potential political martyr for them, they invited him to take over the Army Comrades Association. And Brennan and Cronin willingly stepped aside. And according to one account, at least, that a number of Cumann na Gael TDs went to O'Duffy's house and begged him to take over the new movement. O'Duffy manages to bring in even more conservative rules into the Army Comrades Association. So one of these is that membership was only open to citizens of Irish birth or Irish parentage who profess the Christian faith. So, i.e., no Jews need apply. And you do actually have, in the very early days of the movement, some Jews who do apply to join the Army Comrades Association, or as they're quickly becoming known, the Blueshirts. And one of those is Gerald Goldberg, who was a future mayor of Cork, and he was a Jewish law student in UCC, and he applied to join, and he was told, no, you can't. And he made a complaint to Ned Cronin, and Ned Cronin came back and said, no, you're not allowed to join on account of your religion.
So on a local level, just who was actually joining the Blueshirts? And Pádraig points towards the extraordinary case of someone who had been involved in the murder of Dublin Jews, who ends up in this organisation in Dublin when it's moving in this different direction.
The kind of people who were joining the Blueshirts in Dublin are really interesting as well. Like there's a guy called James Conroy, who joins. Now, he's a Free State Army officer from Dublin. And in 1923, he had been involved in the murder of two Dublin Jews. One of them was a guy called Barnett Goldberg, and the other one was a guy called Emmanuel or Ernest Kahn. And basically, there was a moral panic in Dublin at the time that Jews were going out with Catholic Irish girls. So you had Free State officers who were just going up to them in the street saying, "Are you a Jew?" And when they said yes, murdering them. And I mean, he was never prosecuted for that crime because, well, who was in government at the time, Cumann na Gael, he was pro-treaty. He supported that side, and he was a prominent leader in the Blue Shirts in Dublin. So they were very active in the capital. They were very active in the suburbs and in rural areas. They were active as well in a different fashion, but even in regional cities in Cork, in Limerick, in Galway, everywhere they were active. I mean, we underestimate the size and the danger of this movement. Like, if you look at, we've all seen the Peaky Blinders and Oswald Mosley and all that kind of stuff. You had a population of 50 million people in Britain at the time, and there were 40,000 black shirts. In Ireland, you had a population of just over 3 million, I think maybe more if if we're going north and south, the entire island, and the Blue Shirts were active in small areas of the north. But what you're talking about is a population of 3,047,000 Blue Shirts. And Oswald Mosley never got an MP elected after he formed the British Union of Fascists. They didn't have local councillors, whereas the Blue Shirts, I think, had 60 TDs. They were the main opposition party. They had hundreds of councillors around the country. They were essentially the largest non-governing fascist organisation in the world in the 1930s.
One person who is intrigued and in some ways inspired, at least initially, by Eoin O'Duffy is the poet William Butler Yeats. And like Ezra Pound mentioned at the beginning, Yeats found a lot that he admired in continental fascism. O'Duffy, from a distance, struck Yeats as an impressive figure. And I suppose from a distance, he was an impressive figure. He seemed to be a unifier, and Yeats felt that that's what was needed on the right of politics. Yeats is one of the most intriguing people in this story because he thought about fascism and what it meant. Now, I don't think the rank and file members of the Blue Shirts were fascists. I think most people who joined the Blue Shirts were motivated by far more localised concerns, and far more localised fears. But there were people like the TD Ernest Blythe and like W.B. Yeats around the movement who were more interested, I think, in the ideological dimensions of all of this.
Yeats, throughout his career, was very interested in the esoteric and different ideas of Irish nationalism and was interested in kind of recreating society and all this kind of stuff. What you find is that Yeats is very taken with Eoin O'Duffy. He's taken with the idea of blue shirtism as a force to recreate Irish politics and Irish life. So he manages to actually he joins Fine Gael, the Blue Shirts, as they become, and he took great pride in wearing his blue shirt around Dublin. It should be said as well that loads of leading politicians like John A. Costello, people like Sean McOwen, who were Fine Gael TDs, would walk into the Dáil wearing their blue shirts and attend, Dáil and Shannon's meetings dressed in this political uniform. But Yeats liked swanning around in that uniform and going to the Kildare Street Club. He started writing all these poems that were very strange. I'll give you an example of one. Funnily enough, this isn't on the Leaving Cert syllabus today, but he has one poem that runs, "What is equality? Muck in the yard. Historic nations grow from above to below." So he's saying throw out liberal ideas and ideas of dictatorship are good. So he's fascinated by the Blue Shirts and Eoin O'Duffy until, of course, he actually gets to meet Eoin O'Duffy. So on the 24th of July 1933, he meets with O'Duffy in this place, the Kildare Street Club, and he thinks O'Duffy's a buffoon. He says that this guy, I don't think he understands any of my ideas. I'm not enamored with him at all. And basically, he describes O'Duffy as, quote, an uneducated lunatic. So he then leaves the Blue Shirts. Really, as Roy Foster says in his biography of Yeats, that O'Duffy wasn't extreme enough for him. Yeats continues to be a fan of Mussolini throughout the 30s and 40s. So why Yeats hasn't been sent to Pennsylvania yet, I don't know. But look, people like his poetry, but I think his politics were pretty crap.
State intelligence files, in particular from the Department of Justice, give good insight into what was happening on the ground. And many years ago when I was looking at these files, it struck me that the special branch and state intelligence was considerably more interested actually in the Blueshirts in parts of the country than they were in the IRA. Dublin was a city where political violence happened. Armistice Day in November was always a violent day on the streets. But O'Rourke's research on the nationwide picture of the Blueshirts is sometimes really, really surprising. And if we wonder why the state was later so worried about the idea of a march on Dublin city centre, when we look at this nationwide, things become apparent. And they're a much bigger movement than the IRA could dream of being at the time. They're not scared of putting it up to the IRA, and they're also not scared of putting it up to the Gardaí.
We really underestimate the level of violence that was happening at the time and quite how extreme the blue shirts were. Mosley's black shirts, as far as I'm aware, never killed anyone. The blue shirts certainly did. They're involved in extreme violence. They're having pretty regular gun battles with both the IRA and the Gardaí. In one case, in Kildare in Cork, they actually attack a Garda station, and it's done using war of independence style tactics. They're cutting the phone lines, they're building barricades to prevent reinforcements coming, and they're using rifle and revolver fire to shoot up the building. And remember, at this time, as now, the Gardaí are an unarmed police force. You have blue shirts who are burning down the homes of Fianna Fáil TDs. Now, you can imagine today, like, we would call this, terrorism. You have Gardaí trying to police the blue shirts, and the blue shirts doing things like getting a lorry, putting armour plating on it so that it will be bulletproof, and then driving it at full speed into Garda lines. And we have people driving vehicles into crowds today. We have no hesitation in describing them as fanatics and terrorists, and that's what the blue shirts were doing. The blue shirts do kill people, and people who are blue shirts are killed, particularly by their political opponents and the IRA and the Gardaí.
So the idea of a march on Dublin emulating Mussolini, was that even the intention? That's still the subject of debate. I mean, what they talk about instead is a commemoration, passing the memorial at the rear of Leinster House, the monument to Michael Collins, Arthur Griffith and Kevin O'Higgins, en route to Glasnevin Cemetery. But the fear in government circles is that this commemoration in August 33 is just a cover for something else. The authorities feel that the threat was real, and the atmosphere in the lead up to the day is tense. The police begin raiding the homes of prominent members of the Blue Shirt movement. In Dublin, the IRA devises plans. For example, the idea of attacking the Blue Shirts from the rooftops on Westmoreland Street. But O'Rourke notes that that wasn't just the extent of it. There was more in mind over how this day might go.
On the anti-treaty side, you see all sorts of low-level anti-treaty IRA volunteers being commemorated. On the pro-treaty side, the only person really who's commemorated is Michael Collins. As you go around the country, there are very few memorials to ordinary Free State soldiers, and it's because when these memorials are going up in the 1930s, the politics of kind of the anti-treaty side are still the same, and they're commemorating every single IRA volunteer. The politics of the pro-treaty side are very much one strong man to lead the nation. That man was Michael Collins. And then if they mention a second figure, it's Arthur Griffith. And if they mention a third figure, it's Kevin O'Higgins. And that really is where they start. And what O'Duffy announces when he becomes leader of Blue Shirts is that on the 13th of August 1933, which is, I think, close enough, it's kind of midway between the anniversaries of Griffith and Collins, that he is going to lead a march to the Cenotaph. Now, what is the Cenotaph? Well, it's kind of gone, it's been replaced. If you're walking up Merrion Square and you're on if we call it the backside to Leinster House, and you're looking in, you'll see this big white, what looks like a needle, an obelisk in the middle. That's actually the more recent version of the Cenotaph. The original version was put up very hastily at the end of the Civil War and was meant to be a national monument to Michael Collins and to Arthur Griffith. But the thing about it was actually built out of wood and plaster. So, of course, in Irish weather, it didn't last very long and it started decaying very quickly. But the Free State Army used to hold commemorations at this. And when De Valera power and Eoin O'Duffy becomes leader of the Blue Shirts, he declares that he is going to have a march on Dublin in imitation of Mussolini's March on Rome, and he is going to commemorate this. He is going to commemorate the fallen pro-treaty leaders, and basically, the government is quite worried about this. It's about the time that De Valera tries to start parting himself from the IRA, wants it finished, all kinds of street folk, and wants kind of just regular politics. In fairness to De Valera, again, if you can use such a phrase, he is trying at a time that Europe is in turmoil to keep Ireland on the democratic path. And one of the first things they do is, because of these gunfights happening up and down the country, is they revoke the private firearms licenses that people like Ernest Blythe and Eoin O'Duffy, the Free State leaders, have. And Ernest Blythe, when the guards come to his house, threatens him threatens them with his revolver, and it's kind of like Charlton Heston stuff. You can prize it from my cold dead hands. I'm not giving it over, and the Gardaí actually back off. And in O'Duffy's case, they raid the house and they don't find his licensed handgun, but they find two unlicensed guns. And O'Duffy starts coming out with statements in advance of the march, like, party politics have served their period of usefulness, and the sooner a change is effected, the better. And he promises he's going ahead with the march, no matter what the government does. And he says that he has, quote, a sacred duty to perform, to lead the National Guard, that is the Blueshirts, on the occasion of the parade. And from this duty, I will not flinch, come what may. So the government are determined that they are going to take action to prevent this. They're worried about an outbreak of street violence, and they're right to be worried, because not only is the government trying to stop them, the IRA, who, as I said, are increasingly parting terms with De Valera at this point, the IRA decide that, look, most of O'Duffy's followers, O'Duffy has promised that 20,000 Blueshirts will come to Dublin for this. And the IRA say, look, most of these guys are going to arrive at Houston train station. And what we were going to do, or Island Bridge Station as it may have been known at that stage, what they had actually done was taken over buildings in the area and mounted machine guns on the roof.
In the end, O'Duffy panicked and backed down, and the march on Dublin never came to fruition. The late Tom Garvin, political scientist, remembered, and I remember him telling me this, listening to De Valera speak about all of this when he was a young student himself, and how Dev was quite open and quite honest about his fears around that day. He did wonder if the army could be trusted that day. Would there be a coup d'etat? Irish politics in the 1930s still had the smell of gunpowder off it. Remember, a Fianna Fáil TD would describe them as a slightly constitutional party. So the idea of a coup d'etat wasn't all that strange, but in the end, the day proved to be a damp squib. O'Duffy, though, even by then, was really beginning to unravel as a public character.
You had guns being drawn on the streets. The whole thing was chaotic. And what eventually happens, the Blue Shirt movement, is that O'Duffy becomes an embarrassment. He becomes increasingly unhinged. He is addicted to alcohol. He's making speeches while drunk. And he is standing up and saying, we are not just going to deal with the communists in the south. We're going to march on Belfast and take back the north and all this kind of stuff. And Fine Gael are unhappy with this. And they're going, you're the leader of the party.
So Eoin O'Duffy, a distinguished War of Independence veteran, someone who had taken part directly in the war, a respected figure in the Gaelic Athletic Association, a former Garda commissioner. The end of it all is somewhat farcical. There was Spain, which was a really curious thing in an Irish context, the Spanish Civil War. Fergal McGarry, the historian, makes the point that the Spanish Civil War is now remembered in Ireland as a conflict between democracy and fascism, rather than Christianity and communism. But for O'Duffy, I think, presenting himself as the great defender of faith to a country that was overwhelmingly, it should be said, on the side of Franco and not the Spanish Republic, I think he thought Spain represented a great chance to salvage a reputation or to reinvent himself on the public stage. But even there, he proved a divisive figure. And in the end, De Valera withstood the O'Duffy years.
So O'Duffy returns from Spain, and even his leadership there is controversial, because when the Blue Shirts or O'Duffy's followers, who are now in green shirts or whatever, when they return from Spain and they march off the boat, they marched down the gangplank and they split into two factions. And there's a pro-O'Duffy faction and an anti-O'Duffy faction. So even there, he's failed. And O'Duffy kind of spends his wilderness years just hanging around Dublin, wallowing in past glories. He's meeting with people who are hoping that in World War II there'll be a Nazi invasion of Ireland. He's kind of reliving his past glories of the War of Independence. And O'Duffy's last days, he's in a hospital and the Garda report on him basically says, look, this guy is pathetic. He's not a danger to the state and all he cares about is getting more brandy. And when he dies in 1944, it's very interesting that he's actually granted a state funeral by De Valera. So he gets the gun carriage, he gets the Irish Army, he gets the tricolour on his coffin in recognition of his War of Independence service. And of course, De Valera had no time for him personally, but I suppose De Valera's attitude is he respects the rank rather than the man, and he wants to do something, maybe a nod to the other side, just to keep Ireland in 1944 on the steady, on the level, and keep democracy running. And for all the criticism that I would have of De Valera's politics, we have to say that his finest hour was probably in the 30s and the 40s when he protected the Jewish community and work colleagues like Bob Briscoe from anti-Semitic attacks and made sure their constitutional rights were respected, and thankfully kept us largely out of World War II.